Donald joins the army. When Donald Duck's nephews told him they were going to an army camp, Donald was delighted. "I'll come too," he exclaimed. "I've always wanted to be a soldier." "Oh, you're too old," said the triplets. But on parade the first day, Donald certainly looked the part. Their first task was to get round an obstacle course in 10 minutes. Donald was enjoying himself until he had to swing over the river on a rope. Disaster struck. He caught hold of the rope too low down and was dragged spluttering and gasping through the water. Getting back over the river was even worse. His only route was a slippery pole suspended above the water. Clinging desperately to the underside, he inched his way over the rushing water. Just then he heard the triplets cry, "Watch out, Uncle Donald!" and they thundered across the pole, trampling on his fingers. Splash! Donald got another nasty ducking in the cold river. Wet and dripping, Donald scrambled through a row of barrels quite safely, but when he had to dive through the tire at the other end, his buttons got caught and he was stuck fast. Huey, Louie and Dewey pushed and pulled, and with a mighty rip, Donald burst free. His once smart jacket now in a sorry state, Donald started to haul himself over the next obstacle, a very high wall, when he heard the Sergeant Major bark, "Hands up! Pack the base! Pitch tents! Catch yourself a fish! Light a fire! And cook it!" Now for the easy part, thought Donald, pulling the tent from its bag. But by the time the others were ready to go fishing, Donald was only half finished, and his tent was in a terrible mess. Just as he stepped back to admire his handiwork, the Sergeant Major appeared. "Is this it then, Duck?" he screamed at Donald. "Well, it's inside out! Start again!" Donald groaned. With muscles aching, Donald put up his tent again and made a fishing rod and line. Dejectedly, he sat on the riverbank to catch his supper. But by then the fish had grown tired of being caught and had gone into hiding. All Donald could catch was a tiddler, and he was ravenous. Back at the camp, Huey, Louie and Dewey were sitting round a glowing fire, looking well-fed and contented. "All the rest of the food is gone, Uncle Donald. You'll have to make do with your fish," they giggled. Donald pretended not to hear and went to gather some tinder, but he could only find a few spindly twigs. "Never mind," he told himself, finding a match. "It's only a spindly little fish anyway." Just as he struck the match, the triplets came up behind him. "Uncle Donald, you're not supposed to use matches," they chorused. Donald jumped and the match burned his fingers. He let out a mighty "Ow!" Too tired to worry about the fire anymore, or his rumbling stomach, Donald crawled into his sleeping bag. But he couldn't get comfortable. He seemed to be lying on a bed of rocks, all of them sticking in his back. After tossing and turning for as long as his aching bones would allow, Donald gave up. Stealthily, he crept from his tent and hurried away down the road to the nearest town. There, he booked into the first hotel he found. After a long hot bath and a very large dinner, Donald snuggled down in bed, feeling content at last. "Perhaps I am a bit too old to be a soldier," he admitted drowsily. "Maybe I'm better suited to being a concert pianist, or an artist, or—" But the next minute, he was sound asleep.
Donald's Dream Cottage. Donald decided it was time his nephews learnt about the joys of country life. So he rented a cottage in the country, left the car at home, and they all set off by train. "So we can take healthy country walks," Donald told his nephews, who all groaned loudly. Their first healthy walk was sooner than expected. From the station to the cottage, 3 miles with suitcases, mostly uphill. "Don't they have taxis in the country, Uncle Donald?" wailed Huey, Louie and Dewey. "Walking's good for you," snapped Donald. As soon as they reached the cottage, Donald began to organise dinner. "Go and pick a lettuce from the garden, Huey, and dig up some potatoes," Dewey and Louie, you go to the farm for some eggs and milk. There's nothing like fresh country food. It was a long way to the farm, so Dewey and Louie took a shortcut on the way back. As they hopped over a fence to cut across a field, Dewey heard a noise and looked back. "I say, Louie," he said nervously, "there's a big cow following us, and it looks angry." "That's not a cow, it's a bull!" exclaimed Louie, and the pair of them took to their heels and fled. "Phew! That was a close thing," said Dewey, as they vaulted over the fence. "Oh dear," said Louie, looking down into the basket. "Uncle Donald won't be pleased. We've scrambled the eggs." But when they got back to the cottage, they found Donald standing on a chair, waving a broom and shouting, "Shoo!" and "Go away!" "What's wrong, Uncle?" asked the two boys. "Ants," said Donald dramatically. "Ants all over the place." The ants were marching across the floor and up the table leg, following the trail of a leaky bag of sugar. "Don't worry, Uncle Donald," chuckled Louie. "I'll get rid of them." He picked up the sugar bag and laid a trail of sugar back out of the door. Soon the ants were heading outside again, following the sugar. Just then, Hughie came in with a rather limp-looking lettuce and some scrawny potatoes, and Donald forgot about the ants. Soon they all sat down to eat. "You can't beat homegrown food," said Donald, tucking in. "You can taste the freshness." Giggling, the triplets pointed at Donald. He was just about to munch a juicy caterpillar wriggling among the lettuce leaves. "Ugh," said Donald, dropping his fork. "Well, I'm not hungry at the moment anyway. And it's time for bed," he said, glaring at his nephews. "Early to bed and early to rise in the country." But Donald didn't realise quite how early. The next morning he was woken by the birds singing and the sun streaming through his window. It wasn't until he'd leapt out of bed that he saw it was only 5 o'clock in the morning. He crawled back to bed to try and sleep, but the birds kept him awake. "Drat the things," he grumbled, and stuck his fingers in his ears and pulled the covers over his head. "I thought it was supposed to be quiet in the country." Donald was just dropping off when Hughie, Louie and Dewey bounded into the room and woke him up again. "Time to get up," they shouted. "Go away," said Donald. "Go for a walk to work up an appetite for breakfast." Donald peered out of the window. It was hot and sunny already. He would go and finish his snooze in the garden. Still in his nightshirt and nightcap, he fetched a deck chair from the shed and set it up in the sun. Just as he lowered himself into it with a contented sigh, there was a ripping sound and the canvas gave way. Donald sat down hard on the ground. "Help!" he squawked, struggling wildly. "Get me out of here!" But Hughie, Louie and Dewey couldn't hear. They'd gone for their long walk. "Why didn't I spend my holiday quietly at home?" groaned Donald. "It's much more relaxing than the country."
Donald's Disastrous Day. Donald Duck was in the mood for decorating. As he looked at his leftover tins of paint, a nice bright yellow one caught his eye. "I know," he thought, "I'll brighten up the bedroom by painting the floor." A little later, Donald's nephews bounded up the stairs. They stopped to watch Donald at work. "I say, Uncle Donald," Hughie began. "Now go away and play, boys," said Donald. "Can't you see I'm busy?" "But you started at the door," said Louie. "You shouldn't—" "And why not?" snapped Donald, glaring at him. "Now stop bothering me. I want to finish all this by lunchtime, because I'm taking Daisy out." And he turned his back on the boys. Just as Donald was finishing off, the doorbell rang. "That must be Daisy," Donald said to himself. But when he tried to get to the door, he found he was trapped. He had painted himself into a corner. "Donald, what are you doing?" Daisy called from the doorstep. "I thought we were going out to lunch." I'm afraid it's a bit difficult at the moment," came Donald's voice. "Sorry." "Sorry?" snorted Daisy. "Do you call that an excuse?" And then suddenly her voice changed. "Why, Gladstone," she said, "how lovely to see you. Will you come and have lunch with me?" Through the window, Donald saw Daisy and Gladstone Gander walking off arm in arm. He hopped up and down with rage, while the triplets, who were peeping round the door, stifled their giggles. It was mid-afternoon before the paint was dry enough for Donald to make his escape. He marched off down the garden path without saying a word. Soon afterwards, Gladstone Gander came down the road, carrying an enormous bunch of flowers. "I bet he's taking those to Daisy," said Hughie. "Why can't he leave Uncle Donald's girlfriend alone?" Dewey looked thoughtful. Then he raced into the house and came back with the pepper pot. Just as Gladstone went by the gate, Dewey sprinkled pepper all over the lovely flowers. Gladstone didn't even notice. He put the flowers on Daisy's doorstep. Then he tucked a little note among the blooms. Looking very pleased with himself, he hurried away. A few minutes later, Donald arrived on Daisy's doorstep, proudly clutching a bunch of flowers. He gave a start of surprise when he saw Gladstone's bouquet. Then he snatched the note and read it. "Ha!" he snorted, and promptly threw the note and his flowers into the dustbin. Then he placed his own card in Gladstone's much larger bouquet. The triplets rushed up. "No, no, Uncle Donald, you mustn't," they pleaded. Donald began blustering. "And why not?" he asked. "I'm fed up with Gladstone Gander pestering Daisy." "But the flowers," began Dewey. Too late. Daisy was coming up the path. "Why, Donald," she cried, seizing the bouquet, "what lovely flowers!" And she bent her head to sniff their scent. "Achoo!" she sneezed. "Achoo! Achoo! Achoo!" Donald stared in amazement. Daisy raised her head, her eyes streaming, and glared at him. "Get out of my sight, Donald Duck," she squawked between sneezes. "I never want to see you again." Daisy slammed her front door in Donald's face. "Oh, dear," he groaned. "I should have listened to you boys." But what on earth was wrong with those flowers? Anyone would think they had pepper on them. "Don't be silly, Uncle Donald," said the naughty triplets. "Who'd do a thing like that?" And they hurried off to play, leaving poor Donald pleading with Daisy through the letterbox.
Donald's new toy. It was pouring with rain and Donald was bored. Hughie, Louie and Dewey were quite happy to stay in and read their comics, but it was difficult to concentrate with Uncle Donald pacing up and down. "I know," exclaimed Donald. "I'll take you to the toy shop and buy you each a new toy." "And one for yourself," said Hughie as they went out. "Oh, don't be silly," snapped Donald. "I don't play with toys." In the toy shop, Hughie picked a racing car and Louie chose a computer game. But Dewey couldn't decide. "What about that lovely red hula hoop?" suggested Donald, because he liked the look of it himself. "Well," said Dewey, who was more interested in the space rocket. But before he could say another word, Donald picked up the hoop, paid for all the toys, and bustled the boys out of the shop. Back home it was still raining fast, so Dewey stood his hoop against the wall and played with Hughie and Louie's new toys instead. They pretended not to notice Donald slipping out of the door in his raincoat. But while he played with Dewey's hoop in the garden, the triplets were clustered round the window, watching. They giggled as he spun the hoop and wriggled his hips. The hoop just slid down to his feet and landed. Bonk! Donald picked up the hoop and stormed out of the gate. "We'd better follow him," said Louie. "He's sure to get into trouble." Donald was going to play at rolling the hoop down the hill instead. At first the hoop just wobbled and fell over, but at last off it went, gathering speed as it shot down the hill. "That's the end of that," groaned Dewey as the hoop whizzed by their hiding place with Donald puffing down the hill a long way behind it. "He'll never get it back now." On went the hoop, straight down the main street, and then it crashed into a man who'd just come out of the jeweller's shop and knocked him over. "Oh, no!" groaned the triplets. But when they saw lots of sparkling jewels lying scattered all over the pavement, they gasped in surprise. The runaway hoop had knocked over a jewel thief. The boys raced down the hill and grabbed the stunned robber just as the jeweller came out of his shop. "Well done, boys," he beamed. "How clever to use your hoop like that. I think you deserve a reward." But at that moment, Donald came puffing up. "It's my hoop, actually," he said, and before the surprised jeweller could protest, he pocketed the reward money and made off down the street. The triplets hurried after him and saw him go into the toy shop. "Maybe he's buying us another present," said Dewey hopefully, as they peered through the window. "No such luck," groaned Louis. "Just look, he's used the reward money to buy himself a pair of roller skates."
Donald and the Drummer Boys. Donald Duck was still in bed and snoring loudly when Huey, Louie and Dewey bounded out of bed extra early one morning. It was the triplets' birthday, and they couldn't wait to unwrap their presents. "Look what Daisy gave me!" spluttered Louie excitedly. "It's a drum!" Huey and Dewey tore the paper from their presents. They each had a drum too. It wasn't long before the whole house was shaking to their beat. Donald twisted and turned in his bed and buried himself under the blankets. "Will you be quiet?" he shouted at his nephews. But they couldn't hear a thing because of all the noise they were making. Donald was determined he was not going to be woken at dawn again. So when the boys were in bed that night, he tiptoed into their room and stole their drumsticks. Then he hid them in a very safe place, the dustbin. When Huey, Louie and Dewey got up next morning, they found their drums, but where were their drumsticks? They searched and searched, but it was no good. The drumsticks were nowhere to be found. The boys were very disappointed. "Oh, well," said Louie at last. "Now we're up, we might as well do something. Let's go to Grandma Duck's farm." And off they went, while Donald had a lovely, peaceful lie-in. Grandma Duck was very pleased to see them. "Come in, boys," she said. "You're just in time for a toffee apple." The triplets groaned. Grandma's toffee apples had a reputation of being very hard. Then Louie had a brilliant plan. He knew how to put the toffee apples to good use. "Grandma," he said, "could we have another toffee apple each, if we weed your garden?" Grandma thought she got a pretty good bargain, so she agreed straight away. "Are you mad?" Huey and Dewey complained as they were busy weeding. "Now we have to eat those awful toffee apples and work." "I've got other plans for the toffee apples," said Louie mysteriously. And the three of them huddled together while Louie told them his plan. The weeding was finished in no time. Early next morning, while Donald was still in bed and dreaming of staying there all day, there was a tremendous boom, boom, boom. Donald shot out of bed in fright. The triplets were parading around the house, playing their drums with toffee apples instead of drumsticks. "Oh, no. Well, two can play at that game," muttered Donald. He threw on his clothes and rushed off to town. Very early the next morning, so early, in fact, that the triplets were still asleep, they were woken by a fearful-sounding twang, twang. The boys stumbled into Donald's room, rubbing their eyes. Donald was playing an electric guitar. "What a din!" cried Louie. "Oh, please stop," begged Huey. "You're hurting my ears," said Dewey. "I'll tell you what," said Donald at last. "I won't play my guitar again if you don't play your drums." So Huey, Louie and Dewey agreed, and every morning after that there was peace in Donald's house.
Donald's winter holiday. One cold winter's day, Donald Duck and his three nephews, Louie, Huey and Dewey, were sitting round a blazing fire looking at brochures for winter holidays and watching the snow fall outside. Finally it was decided they would go on a cruise. They set off at once to the travel agent, but when they got there, everything was fully booked. "We do have one adventure cruise left, though, sir," said the agent. "Adventure cruise?" Donald asked. "Yes, sir," said the agent, pulling out the brochure. "It's a bit more exciting than a normal cruise. You're in charge of the boat, you see." Donald was doubtful, but his nephews wouldn't give him any peace until he'd agreed to go. And before he realized it, Donald had parted with the money for an adventure cruise and was on his way to the docks. "We've got to find a boat called the Great Adventure," said Donald, looking around vaguely. Then Dewey pointed. "There it is!" he cried. "It's an old tug!" screamed Donald in horror. But the triplets were delighted. They could play at being pirates on the high seas. With Donald grumbling loudly about all the money he'd wasted, they went on board. Donald sweated as he stoked up the engine, but the triplets made a pirate's flag and planned to make Donald walk the plank. "Well," said Donald grumpily after they'd been at sea for a few hours, "I'm going to bed. How do you stop this thing anyway?" "Try the anchor," suggested Hughie, but it was so heavy they all had to hang on to Donald to stop him toppling overboard with it. Next morning, Donald jumped out of his bunk and found himself up to his knees in water. The boat was sinking. While Donald tried to bail them out, the triplets waved at a distant ship. "Help!" they cried. The ship got nearer and nearer until it was right alongside. The captain threw down a rope ladder and they all climbed up it to safety. "Welcome aboard," said the captain, trying not to stare. Over a lovely hot breakfast, the captain said, "I've got some bad news for you, I'm afraid. We're bound for the Sunshine Islands, and I can't turn back to take you home. So please enjoy yourselves. It's quite free." But Donald and the boys didn't mind the bad news one bit. "Oh, this is the life for me," Donald sighed as he watched the boys playing happily in the pool on deck. "And to think it'll be another month before we get home." And when they did get home, Donald went straight round to the travel agent, seized him by the collar, and suggested he try one of his own adventure cruises. The agent went quite white with fright and gave all Donald's money back at once.